guess we're live now. Can we start? I guess. Yeah. All right. Assalamualaikum. Good evening, and I hope everyone is doing well, mentally, physically, and also emotionally during this time of pandemic. I'm Nabilah binti Abdul Hamid on behalf of Virtual IIUM. So tonight we will be talking about the analysis of reopening Muslim minds, a return to reason, freedom, and tolerance. So tonight's program is initiated by Virtue IIUM, a student movement based in IIUM Gombak, International Islamic University, Malaysia, in collaboration with four other student movement, Democrat UM, Demuda, Lestari Hikmah, and also PPI IIUM. So before we get started, I guess it's best for me to introduce a little bit about our guest speakers tonight, Mr. Imran Taib and also Mustafa Akyol. So our first speaker, Mr. Mustafa Akyol from Turkey. He is the author of tonight's discussion, the Reopening Muslim Minds, a Return to Reason, Freedom and Tolerance. And he was the lecturer at Political Science Department at the Fatih University in Istanbul in 2012 until 2016, and also contributing monthly as an opinion writer at the International New York Times since 2013 until today. So next, our second guest speaker, Imran Mohamed Taib. He is an interfaith activist in Singapore and also active with the Reading Group, a platform for critical discussions on Malay intellectual issues, and also actively writes on religion and society. So I guess it's time to pass the floor to both of our guest speakers.
Thank you, Nabilah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Greetings, peace be on all of you. Thank you for joining this session. I don't think I'm in a position to be a co-speaker for this program because Mustafa Akyol had written an entire book, so it's only fair if I'll be a co-speaker if I have a book on my own in engagement with the ideas that he has. But I'm here also to probably ask a few questions later on and to provide some analysis as well as my own opinions in relation to the ideas in the book. But before we go into all that, my own personal reading of this book, which I have here, and it's very widely available now in Singapore. I'm not sure about Malaysia though. I find it very engaging and interesting because a lot of the ideas, key ideas, really resonate with the kind of work that I do also in Singapore and in my engagement in activist circles, Muslim activist circles in the region. I find that the spirit of the book is really about reform from within. Of course, Muslims have been talking about reform for more than a century, ever since we have encountered with the West and realized that the tables have turned between a civilization that was a beacon and also at the peak of leading humanity in the sciences, the discoveries, the technologies, knowledge, production, etc., to be one that was dominated, being colonized, and therefore there was a search for a kind of reasons why Muslim societies were at that abysmal state, while at the same time also looking at the West, or in particular with European civilization, and measuring its own success vis-a-vis what the Muslims had. So all that were happening at the turn of the 19th century, and all the way, and we are still in this situation where Muslim societies are grappling with many of these issues. Between the search for authenticity that is really drilled into our own traditions, but at the same time progressing and looking at modernity as something to be embraced and not to be abandoned, like the baby with the bathwater. So the spirit of the book is not looking outward into reasons of Western domination as well as colonialism, etc., but really an internal examination, and I would say a re-examination of what had gone wrong in Muslim societies. So it's a call for reform from within that has three aspects. One is to uncover what had gone wrong, and two is also to look into what we had in the past, in our traditions that had made us able to be the beacon of civilization, particularly in the 9th and 10th century. And thirdly, in order to uncover what we had gone wrong and to look at the inadequacies that we have right now, I think it requires the courage to think, to reason, to confront with our own problems internally, and to acknowledge where we had gone astray. So I think that's the value of the contribution of Mustafa Akyol through this book, Reopening Muslim Minds. To me, this is therefore a book not for the weak hearts or those who will be easily triggered by words like akal or reason, by words like freedom or even pluralism or even tolerance. The very idea of tolerance is somehow something that is so scary to some Muslims. Although this book is precisely what these people should be reading. Of course, Mustafa Akyol is not known as someone who will mince his words, and I've told him earlier that I think we should be as candid and frank in our conversation because we are in the company of people who are seriously engaging in the intellectual development of our societies. And that is probably why his writings had irked certain segments of the Muslim conservative public. In fact, it is worth noting that his previous book, Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty, has been banned in Malaysia since 2017 on account of it being prejudicial to public order and interest and likely to alarm public opinion, as well as not in line with Sunni Islam and can cause confusion among Muslims in Malaysia. I'm wondering what Mustafa thinks about all this, but that is something else that we can discuss later on. But Mustafa himself, aside from having his previous book being banned, he himself was briefly detained on his last visit to Malaysia in that same year under the invitation of the Islamic Renaissance Front for a series of lectures, which that's where I attended some of your lectures, Prof. Sorry, Mustafa, in Malaysia. So what had happened since then is that he wrote this new book with the opening chapter detailing what happened during the harrowing period under the custody of the religious police. But don't expect a sensational description of that account in this book, because this book is not about that. Yeah, it is his subsequent wrestling with the question of what happened to us in the Muslim world that is at the center of the book. And in all this, he identified several key problems, of which I will leave it to him to explain and elaborate later, as well as a plea for Muslims to re-embrace the tradition of reason, freedom, and tolerance that are values not opposed to Islam, but in fact are the very values that have brought civilizational achievements to not just Muslims, but humanity as a whole. And that, he contends, is where even Europe is indebted to Muslim thought. And that's why in the earlier parts of the chapters, he was talking really about the inspiration derived from the work of Ibn Tufail, which is Hayy bin Yaqzan, even if Europe would not acknowledge it today. Now, I have some questions and views about the book, but I will leave it for later. For right now, I think, Mustafa, it would be good if you can introduce us to the book, to the main arguments, the purpose of you writing it, and what are the contentions surrounding the ideas in the book.
Thank you very much, Imran, for this very kind introduction. Thanks to Elif and others in the group to organize this. I'm very happy to be speaking to friends from Malaysia and of course beyond. You in your introduction you mentioned the fact that there was this more magnificent golden age of Islam, and we all long for that, right? I mean, Muslims today are proud with the fact that 1,000 years ago, the Islamic civilization was the inventor of, or the developer of algebra or geometry or certain scientific inventions from optics to health that made its way into Europe. So what was the secret of that success, early Islamic success, compared to the not so great state of the ummah today in the past few centuries. And of course, everybody has answers to that. But my answer is that 1,000 years ago, in the first formative centuries of Islam, the ummah, the Muslim community, was intellectually more self-confident. They were not thinking that if they study Greek philosophy or other ancient sciences, they will not be corrupted by it, but they will learn something from it. And they also believe that Islam gives us not all the wisdom and knowledge that we need, but it gives us a global perspective, because all world is created by God, and the natural order of the world can be studied by anybody, even if they're not Muslims, or let them be infidels, like people like Aristotle. There was this more universalistic outlook in the Islamic civilization, which was more self-confident. I think in the modern era, partly because of Western colonialism, which bears a lot of responsibility for our troubles, but also because of our own internal mindset. We develop this idea that we should reject anything that is not Islamic, right? So ban the books. I mean, 1,000 years ago, we were not the ones banning books. It was the Christians. It was Christian Europe. But today, unfortunately, we have a leadership in banning ideas, or jailing people for their thoughts. And I think that's not a good leadership, for the ummah. Because when you ban ideas, when you shut yourself from different thought, you ultimately stagnate. If you face ideas, which can be wrong ideas from your religious perspective, but if you deal with them with an intellectual rigor, if you say, how do I respond to this, not by banning it, but by having a conversation with it, you become intellectually more mature. And that comes out in science, that comes in philosophy, that comes in even your understanding of religion. Now, you mentioned my adventure in Malaysia in 2017. So, and that is actually a story that I relate in the beginning of my book. So I want to say a few things about that. I mean, I mentioned this in a few recent speeches, so I don't want to be repetitive, but since we have a lot of friends from Malaysia today, so this is not a story that I don't want to touch upon, because it also says something. Now, you mentioned Islamic Renaissance Front, which is a wonderful organization based in Kuala Lumpur. I have good friends there, from Ahmed, Farooq Musa, and others, who are really struggling to open up the discussion we need in issues in issues relating to Islam, freedom, and tolerance, and openness. Anyway, they brought me to Malaysia several times. They translated my earlier book, Islam Without Extremes, into Malay. And in 2017, September, they invited me again for public events in Kuala Lumpur, on conferences, where I will be the main speaker, but there will be others as well. So I took that invitation. I came to Kuala Lumpur again. That was my last trip to Kuala Lumpur. And we had several panels. The second one was on a very sensitive topic. If you're from Malaysia, you're probably familiar with this sensitive topic. That is ridda, or apostasy, which is, renouncing your religion in Islam, renouncing your faith in Islam, renouncing your religion, and choosing another faith, or becoming an atheist, let's say. Now, I gave this 30-minute lecture, and I said, look, no Muslim wants to see another Muslim losing his faith, right? That's not something we want to promote. We're not speaking about that. I mean, we all want people to keep their iman, their faith. However, if somebody really loses his faith and becomes somehow, misguided from an Islamic point of view, and or sees the light in some other conviction, becomes a Christian or atheist, should we really see this as a crime to be, investigated by the authorities? Now, the answer is yes, according to some Muslims, because in Saudi Arabia, Iran, in several other countries where an interpretation of the Sharia is imposed by the state, the answer is death penalty, right? I mean, apostates are given the death penalty. Generally, it is tried to be, because of international pressure, they put them in jail at least instead of executing them. But there have been executions on this issue as well. And of course, Malaysia is moderate, so Malaysians don't take that harsh line. But still, there are correctional facilities, rehabilitation centers. 4 passes. And I gave this 30-minute in Kuala Lumpur. It was a golf club. I mean, it's maybe you know the venue, but it was an intellectual setting. And I gave this 30 minutes talk saying that, hey, listen, yes, we have this verdict in classical fiqh, that's Islamic jurisprudence interpretation of the Sharia, but the context was very different then. In that time, changing your religion also implied most of the time changing your political allegiance, like joining the enemy. In other words, it had a sense of political rebellion, which we don't have today in that sense. So we should understand that we are speaking of different contexts here. Then I referred to the Quranic verse La ikraha fi din, Baqarah 256, a part of the verse, the beginning of the verse, which has been, of course, become a very off-quoted statement from the Quran. There is no compulsion in religion, which shows in a very strong way that religion is something that cannot be enforced. Your faith cannot be enforced. And then I made the argument that, listen, if people do not believe in Islam or lost their faith, we cannot really make them believe again by threatening them. We cannot make them real mu'min, that is, believers. We can make them hypocrites. And that is not something we really want to see. I mean, hypocrisy is worse than disbelief, according to our understanding. So I said religion is something that can be nurtured and proclaimed, but it cannot be imposed. And therefore, I said it cannot be policed. A lot of people liked the talk, and I got applause, and people were leaving. And then 5 or 6 serious men walked into the room, and they said, "Are you Mustafa Akyol?" I said, "Yes." They said, "You said religion cannot be policed." Well, we are the religion police. So they showed me their identity cards, and their job is defined as religion enforcement officers. So these were the Javi officers. So they asked some questions that day, but let me go. But the next day, I heard that I was summoned to their headquarters. My host said, you have a flight tonight anyway. You should go, and you can deal with this through lawyers later. There's no rush. And I followed that advice, but when I went to the airport, I realized that they had issued an arrest order on my behalf. So I was detained at the airport. I said, Jabi came a few hours later, and they said I violated the law which bans teaching without tevliya, that is permission from the authorities. And actually, that's, as I understand, a law about preaching in mosques, but they somehow extended it to an academic conference in this case, which was, as I understand, a little bit unusual. Anyway, the next day I was taken to a court which questioned me, and ultimately they let me go. I appreciate that part. And then I was able to leave Malaysia some 24 hours later. But the question was, and that was thanks to some diplomacy that I explained in the book, and I appreciate the people who were engaged in that diplomacy, again, that I mentioned in the book. Now, this is a personal story, but what is interesting is the theological or jurisprudential detail there. The Javi officers who arrested me asked me a few times, "Did you really quote La ikraha fi din? There is no compulsion in religion." I said, "Yes." I mean, I thought, what should be the problem with that? They probably took this as evidence that I was teaching Islam without tevliya, without permission. So that's what they wanted to establish. But also, I wondered, how do they interpret La ikraha fi din? There's no compulsion in religion. That strong statement from the Quran. And I suspected, do they do what the Saudis do? Some Saudi translations do. And I looked into the Jakim websites. You're probably familiar with Jakim, right? The official religious ministry in Malaysia. So Jakim offers an English translation of the Quran. And there, no compulsion in religion is translated into English a little bit differently, with a little insertion into the verse. Now I'll try to show what it is. Do you see this screen now? Okay, good. So this is Baqarah 256. There shall be no compulsion in religion. That's from the Quran. The version goes on and says, Truth has become clear from error, and whoever believes in it has the firmest handhold. So it just continues to say that truth is clear, but so there should be no compulsion. Now, when you read the words like this, it seems to mean that no compulsion means freedom. It's another word. I mean, freedom is generally defined as the lack of coercion. Being free means you're not enforced to do something against your will. Of course, you will be enforced to not to steal people's wealth, but I mean, every society has certain enforcements against crime. But in matters of faith, do you believe in a religion or not, you will not be coerced. So that's the whole idea of religious freedom. And it is interesting that we have this in the Quran. I mean, not every religious tradition has its own scripture, such a proclamation of freedom. So this is something also we Muslims can be proud of. Khalid Abu Fadl, one of the, I think, great contemporary scholars of Islam, he says, with this verse, we were ahead of the curve. I mean, 14 centuries ago, no religion proclaimed that there shall be no compulsion in religion. Christians were forcibly converting a lot of pagans into Christianity by force. So this verse actually ruled out that. And that's why forced conversion has not been a norm in the Islamic tradition. But when you read Jakim and their translation, you see a little nuance. So this is a screenshot from the web page of Jakim that I got a few years ago. Here you see the verses there shall be no compulsion in religion. But there's a little thing here, you see, in parentheses, there shall be no compulsion in religion in becoming a Muslim. So they insert in parentheses this little phrase. Some Saudi translations, like Sahih International, also do the same thing. There shall be no compulsion in religion in acceptance of the religion. So there shall be no compulsion, but only while accepting Islam. Why are they inserting these small clauses into this verse? Because these clauses limit the freedom that is proclaimed by the verse. Because if you say there is no compulsion only in entering, it means, well, there will be compulsion if you exit, which is apostasy, which they consider as a crime that is punishable by death, or at least some other means, at least imprisonment in the modern age. And of course, also, when you are in the religion, you can be forced by the religion police, the Hisba forces. Again, I think that's the job of Javi in Malaysia. Whether you're fasting in Ramadan, right? I mean, if you fast in Ramadan, if you do not fast and you eat and drink on the street in Ramadan, the police can come and admonish you for that somehow to correct your behavior. Now, this is a small glimpse of a broader issue that I am discussing in the book. Why are these translations of the Quran are inserting these little clauses into this key verse? Because they believe that actually there should be compulsion in religion. And because they don't rely on the Quran only, of course, they rely on traditional jurisprudence, that is fiqh, which takes the Quran, but also the much larger, broader body of hadith, that is words and sayings, reported words and sayings, and deeds of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And also there are traditional schools of thought that interpreted the hadith and the Quran together to come to certain verdicts. And in all those verdicts, apostasy was seen as a crime. Now, a key issue here is, in this particular issue, is hadith, of course. Because while the Quran says there's no compulsion in religion, there are a few hadiths that on the matter of apostasy that bring a different verdict. And but there are two hadiths on this. Both of them are in Sahih al-Bukhari, the most authoritative source of hadiths. One of them plainly reads, "Whoever changes his religion, then kill him." This is the key basis for the ban on apostasy. The other one is another hadith which says, "The blood of a Muslim is not lawful to shed unless he is one of the three: a married adulterer, someone killed in retaliation for killing another, or someone who abandons his religion and the Muslim community." So someone who abandons his religion and the Muslim community is ridda, apostasy. And it's interesting that there is an emphasis on leaving the community here, which again gives a hint about the maybe political nature of the apostasy that was being discussed there. Now the question is, so when Javi puts in parentheses into the Quran, they have these two hadiths in mind because that's what the traditional jurisprudence did. Because of these hadiths, they limited the Quranic proclamation on freedom. But in my book, I discussed this issue, and scholars of Islamic jurisprudence, usul al-fiqh, would certainly know this. These two hadiths, although they are considered sahih, they are not mutawatir. They are ahad hadiths. Now, I don't know what these terms mean to you, but many Muslims, when they consider something in Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih al-Muslim, the two books, plus the four books, but the two books are seen as the most sahih ones. These are authentic. Most Muslims automatically can assume everything is there is fully 100% undoubtful. However, scholars also made a distinction between mutawatir and ahad hadiths. And a mutawatir hadith is a hadith that's been narrated by so many people from different sources that those people couldn't have lied about it or they could not have been mistaken about it. And very few hadiths that are in the Sahih collections are actually mutawatir. A few hundreds hadiths in total are mutawatir, and that's it. A much larger body of hadiths that are considered sahih, that is authentic, is ahad, which means they have one narrator. It's called solitary hadiths. And there was a dispute in early Islam on whether an ahad hadith, a hadith with one narrator, can really override a general statement that's called or umum of the Quran. Hanafis were skeptical about this, whereas Imam Shafi, the founder of the Shafi'i school, which is, I think, the official school in Malaysia, Imam Shafi insisted that the ahad hadiths can override some of the general statements of the Quran. And Imam Shafi established the basis of the Sunni jurisprudence, to which other Sunni schools gradually had to come to in a great extent. So actually what I'm saying is that it was a doubtful issue in early Islam whether one hadith with one narrator and ahad hadiths with just one narrator. And the narrator is, by the way, a person who's doubted by some scholars, even in the hadith al-hadith community. It was disputed, but ultimately this was established. And it became a rule that you can kill the apostates. You should kill the apostate. And this was implemented in certain periods in Islamic history for sure. Now, to me, this is an example of some of the universalistic liberating messages of the Quran being limited, narrowed down by the early Muslim community with its own political culture and context. Because La ikraha fid din is such a strong statement. It's like La ilaha illallah. It's that very strong La there. It just overrides everything. There is no compulsion in religion, but you say no, hadiths show us that they should be killed. Also, the rebellion of tribes during the time of Caliph Abu Bakr and the way he responded to that was taken as a precedent to justify the issue of apostasy. But again, I think that was very much limited with its own context. No wonder some of the important companions of Prophet Muhammad, such as Umar, which would become the second caliph, initially doubted Caliph Abu Bakr's decision on that, which was again a political decision. Now, whatever happened in history has happened, but today the ban on apostasy is with us. Is this an issue? This is an issue. I mean, once in a while you'll read in the news that a man in Iran is arrested because he's a convert to Christianity. Now, imagine if a Muslim was arrested in Finland because he's a convert. A Christian was arrested because he's a convert to Islam. Now, in other words, imagine if Christians also punished their apostates. Some have become, Muslims. We Muslims will be quite enraged about it. rightly so. So we should understand how it looks from the other way around. Second, the ban on apostasy isn't used only for going after apostates, which actually happens rarely, I mean, both in Islamic history and today. But it is also used sometimes to punish Muslims who just think differently. Because we also have this notion of takfir, that by looking into the ideas of some Muslim, by looking at his interpretations of Islam, you can declare him a kafir. Again, this is very, I think, problematic, but people do this. If you study philosophy, someone can come and say you are becoming a kafir because you're buying into the ideas of these infidels, which has a precedent, in classical Islam. Or if you offer an interpretation of the Quran that doesn't go well with the conservatives, they will first blame you to be a Ahl al-Bidah, which is innovator, which is a heretic, still not a kafir. But if you take certain steps, you can be declared a kafir. And once you declare a kafir, what happens to you? Well, the ban on apostasy applies to you. And we have had Islamic scholars executed for illegit apostasy. One was Mahmoud Taha, a scholar from Sudan. He was executed publicly in 1985 only because he said that the Meccan verses of the Quran are actually more important or more universally definitive and binding than the Medinan verses, which was turning upside the traditional theory of abrogation, turning it upside down. Just because of that idea, he was declared a kafir and then he was executed. So the ban on apostasy also is used to silence Muslims who are not apostates, who are believers, but who just have opposite ideas, different ideas. And also, we should not forget that when groups like ISIS or Al Qaeda, bomb Muslim cities or kill fellow Muslims, they rely on the idea that apostates should be killed. The only difference is that their definition of apostasy is much more strict than the mainstream. But the mainstream view is already problematic, in my view. Now, this is one of the issues that I have. And in my book, I get through this issue of apostasy. I show the history of these hadiths. I show the discussions about this. And I argue that the Quran should not be overridden by hadiths whose authenticity should be doubted. The same issue is true for blasphemy. Blasphemy, Sab al-Rasul, is another category in classical jurisprudence. There, the issue is not that somebody leaves Islam, but somebody non-Muslim coming saying something offensive about Prophet Muhammad. Should this be a reason to punish that person, kill that person? Well, a lot of people think like that. That's why in Pakistan, almost every month, you hear somebody being arrested, almost often false charges of blaspheming against Prophet Muhammad. You have sometimes terrorist acts in the middle of Europe and elsewhere because of a cartoonist who offended Prophet Muhammad. Cartoons that I don't condone for sure, but should he be attacked or punished by Muslims? Some people think like that. That's the extreme view. But even in the mainstream view, you should be killed for insulting Prophet Muhammad. Now, does it come from the Quran? Again, not. There's nothing in the Quran about punishing blasphemers. The Quran actually has verses about blasphemy, and it says, just be steadfast and patient against them. There's a verse in the Quran which says, you will hear offensive words from the mushrikun, the polytheists, and the people given the book before you, that is previous monotheists. And you have to be steadfast. I mean, it doesn't say go and kill those people. There's another verse in the Quran, actually twice the Quran says that, one in Surah Al-Nisa. It says, if you hear God's verses being mocked by a group of people, do not sit with those people unless they engage in a different discourse. So it doesn't say when people mock your religion, go and kill them. It says just do not sit with those people, do not engage with those discussions. So the ban on blasphemy too, again, came later in Islamic law with some reported actions of Prophet Muhammad about some targeted killings. But in my book, I have a chapter on blasphemy, and there I show that the actions of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that are shown as a basis for blasphemy laws are actually complicated, and it is not a basis for blasphemy law, because the individuals who were killed by the orders of the Prophet in those incidents were not merely blasphemers, they were active enemies of the Muslim community, early Muslim community. They were provoking war, they were physically attacking Muslims. And I think we should understand that the Prophet Muhammad and the first Muslims gave a war of survival against the polytheists of Mecca and their growing allies. But everything in that war of survival doesn't mean that Muslims are in a situation like that in the modern world today. And even there, we have stories of Prophet Muhammad actually not punishing people who merely insulted him with words. Sometimes he showed compassion. He rather showed patience, and he sometimes advised patience to Muslims like Umar, who were trying to punish people for blasphemy. Now, another theme I discuss in the book is hisba, that is religious policing, and that is this whole idea that there should be organized forces in the Muslim society which will look around people and if punish them if they're drinking wine, or flog them if they are not married but holding hands in a park, or that it happens in Aceh province in Indonesia, for example, or in Kenya, or in Saudi Arabia, for sure Iran, whether women are wearing hijab or not, you have to enforce that. And again, it has very little basis in the Quran. It comes from an interpretation of the Quranic commandments, command the right and forbid the wrong, but I show how this was interpreted in early Islamic history as the proclamation of faith, not imposing every detailed commandment of the Sharia, but it came to that way. And I also show that Prophet Muhammad established an institution called the Muhtasib, which is today the basis of the religion police forces, Hisba. The Javi calls it the Hisba force. But Prophet Muhammad established the Muhtasib not to monitor everybody whether they are praying on time or not, but to avert fraud in the Medina market. So it was against actually policing against, it was not moral policing, it was policing against cheating in the marketplace, which should be, of course, crime in any society. In other words, we have all these jurisprudential issues that are really very controversial in the world today. And I believe these are not helping Islam. Today, all the guardians of all this orthodoxy who wants to flog people for drinking alcohol, or who wants to force people to fast in Ramadan and make the woman cover hijab, they are not making Muslim societies more pious, because they are rather making people lose their faith. They're making people be disappointed with the faith. As I said a few times, the hunters of apostates are the main reason for the apostates. I've studied the stories of people who left Islam, and there's a whole bunch. There's an ex-Muslim movement in America, elsewhere, and they have different stories. Some of them just studied philosophically and became atheists, and I understand that. But also, in some of their stories, you see that, oh, I was beaten up by this narrow-minded imam in this madrasa, or I saw how they are going after people because they are just simply gay, or I saw how people are being beaten for not praying, or how women are chased by the religion police in Iran for not wearing the hijab. So the very idea of enforcement, if its goal is to really make pious and send them to heaven, works quite contrary. And I think these coercive measures are really blocking us Muslims from sharing our values with the rest of the world. I think Islam has wonderful values that attract people, that will inspire humanity at a time when the Western civilization is in crisis. Racism is a big issue, obsession with skin color, and Islam has values that I think can appeal more and more people in the world. But it does. You see probably people who are becoming Muslims, famous people. Once in a while, you read on the news they become Muslims. Look, why do they become Muslims? Do they ever say, I love Javi and the Mutawwa and the revolutionary guards in Iran, how beautifully they beat people if they don't fast in Ramadan? What a wonder. They don't say that. They don't come for that. They come for piety. They come for spirituality. They come for Sufism. They come for love of God. They come for the compassion of our Prophet. None of them comes and says, I read this wonderful doctrine on jihad, which says, kill every kafir. Well, no, they actually come because they read about the toleration of Islam. They read about the golden age of Islam. So I think this whole idea that you should use force to advance religion is a problem, especially in the modern day and age where the values of humanity have changed. So I'm calling for a jurisprudential revision, a tajdid on this issue. And in one chapter in my book, I say the big remedy we need, call it a great reform or renewal, is really having no compulsion in religion. It is, in other words, giving up coercive power in the name of Islam. This means no more religious and moral policing, no threats to apostates and innovators, that's heretics, no blasphemy laws, no public floggings of no public floggings or stoning for sinners, which doesn't exist in the Quran, and no violence or intimidation in the family. Now, how do we get there? Actually, it's a big discussion, and much of my book is devoted to that, and I couldn't get in even there. But I basically uphold the Quran over the post-Quranic tradition, the primacy of the Quran. Hadiths are important. Hadiths give us a lot of information about the life of Prophet Muhammad and his wisdom, but they should be always compared with the Quran, and Quran should override the Hadiths and not the other way around. Second, the theory of the abrogation of the Quran should be questioned and I think overturned, because one problem we have in our jurisprudence is that verses in the Quran about toleration, about pluralism, verses like "to you your religion, to me mine," which the Muslims proclaim to Meccan polytheists, were abrogated by jihad verses, by war verses, by some medieval jurists. And I think this was not what the Quran originally intended. It was what the imperial powers of the Muslim world required at the time. And the Quran should be seen as a whole, not an partially abrogated text. And more importantly, understanding the contextuality of our religious texts, even the Quran itself. And I think Islamic scholars, Muslim scholars like Fazlur Rahman in the past century did important work here in showing that when we're reading a commandment of the Quran, we should just not look at the letter, but also the intention, the maqsad or the maqasid, the intentions behind the text. Which brings us into some matters of theology, not just jurisprudence. And that's why actually my book discusses a lot of theology about that. And probably I don't have time for that now, but just I'll close with this word. There was an interesting discussion in early Islamic theology, which I also pay much attention in the book, the matter of husn kubh. I don't know if you're familiar with that. But it was this discussion that whether the commandments of God, the Sharia, indicates ethical values that can be knowable by human reason, even if there was no Sharia, or whether the Sharia establishes values that otherwise would not be known, otherwise would not even exist. In other words, is theft wrong because God said so? Or does God say theft is wrong because it is objectively wrong? So this dilemma called the Euthyphro dilemma, which is actually the big portion of my book. I mean, I didn't get there, but I'm showing how this was important. Of course, the Asharite school, which established the mainstream Sunni approach on this, and as I understand in Malaysia too, insisted that the Sharia establishes value. So if there was no Sharia, there would be no value. And only because God said so, we have ethical values. Whereas the Mu'tazila, and later the Maturidis, which is a Sunni school, mainstream Sunni school. Mu'tazila was Sunni too. I mean, people think Mu'tazila was outside of the fold of Sunni Islam, but early Hanafis, most early Hanafis were Mu'tazila. So there was a strain in Sunni Islam which was more rationalist. And later the Hanafis, the Maturidis, Hanafi tradition kept that idea that right and wrong, things are good and bad, not because only the Sharia says so, but they are objectively right and wrong. Which means even if people are not Muslim, by their God-given conscience, they can understand ethical values, which means they can be good people too, even if they are not Muslim. and we can even learn from them. That's why Aristotle's ethics, virtue ethics, was very influential in early Islam, who believed in this universality. It also means that when we read a religious fatwa, a religious verdict by a scholar, we have something else other than the fatwa itself to refer to, which is conscience, which is our own ethical sense, and which is the ethical philosophy that humanity has developed, because finding ethical value is not just a matter of jurisprudence, but it's a matter of human intuitions. And in my book, I show how that perspective was defended by Ibn Rushd in a very little known vision from him, how it has been helpful in the rationalist approaches to jurisprudence in Islam, how even some Hanbali scholars like Ibn al-Tufi, emphasize that maslaha, the benefit of humans, is more important than the verdicts of jurisprudence. But how losing that perspective in the modern era has led us to implementing religious verdicts without understanding their intention and even judging their consequences. Somebody told you that you should execute apostates, you do it without understanding that you are only creating more apostates, and you're not really helping Islam, and you're not really even serving the divine intention behind the whole Sharia. So I think I spoke a lot. Sorry about that. Maybe I overused my time. But these are some of the highlights of my book. And if you have a chance to read, you'll probably see more of all these issues and even more. One more thing. There will be scholars, I'm sure, who will listen to this. They will say, oh my God, this is bid'ah. And they will say, no, nothing can in the Sharia can ever change. And all the commandments are there forever, and there might be little minor ijtihad, but not when there's nas. I'll ask them about what they think about slavery. Slavery was a part of the Sharia until the 19th century. It was a part of Islamic law. Every Muslim majority society had slavery. When the Ottoman Empire banned slave trade in the middle of the 19th century, some conservative ulama, clerics there, Sharif Abdul Muttalib namely, said the Turks have become kuffar, infidels, and he launched the bloody war against the Ottoman Empire. Because it's in the Hadith and even in the Quran. Now, today, many, I think, reasonable conservatives will tell you that, well, we had slavery because it was not the intention of Islam to have slaves. Islam found it in its context. When Islam came to this world in the 7th century, Islam began with revelation, it was already there. So the Islamic aim was to actually abolish it, but it couldn't happen overnight. So Islam actually improved the status of slaves, gave them new rights, and ultimately the goal was to get rid of it in the long run, which luckily happened in the 19th century, in some places in the 20th century. Now, if we agree that slavery was a part of the Sharia, but it's good that it's gone today, why can't we make adjustments like that in other issues? Why can't we understand also that the idea that men should always rule over women, and it's the husband who should always make the decisions and have more rights in everything, was not an intention of Islam, but it was the part of the context which Islam found, and in which actually it uplifted women by giving them more rights in that context. So I think there are already issues like slavery, like democracy, that Muslims didn't think about it until the modern era, that now many Muslims accept. So if we have been able to make a transition on those issues, why can't we do it on other issues? Because the point is the same. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much. And I would love to hear your questions, comments, protests, and any feedback is welcome.
Thank you, Mustafa. I think that was an excellent overture of your book. And I do note that I think the main central argument that you're trying to push for is this whole idea of la ikraha fid din, no compulsion in religion, which is very central to the whole construction of the argument there. Now, of course, many of the things that you mentioned are not new, and they have been developed by many scholars, ranging from Khalid Abu Fadil, Abdul Aziz Rashidina, Arkun, and many others. But somehow some of these ideas did not get translated into certain societal circles. Now, I think that is what I'm primarily concerned about, that the ideas are out there, the reformist ideas are out there, they've been very well developed, but somehow it does not get translated to the masses. Instead, what the masses get is a very traditionalist perspective that is also highly politicized to fit a certain agenda or interest of people who are in power. So that has been the question that many reformists today has been struggling with. It also speaks about the need for some kind of, it speaks about a crisis in educating the Muslim mind. And I think one reason could be that the reformists have lost the spaces within influential sectors of society, particularly in the education sector in Muslim majority countries. I'm talking about. Maybe it's slightly different in a more liberal and open democratic countries in the Western Hemisphere. There is a lot more contestations and opportunities to discover and engage with these ideas, but not so in many Muslim majority countries because of certain contexts and conditions. So that is what I'm primarily concerned about, because to me, beyond the basics of the religion, the fundamentals, the usul, like the Arkanul Iman and Arkanul Islam, which Khalid Abu Fadil talks about. These are things that are very fundamental, and there's very few of them. Beyond that, all other aspects of religion is a matter of interpretation and contestations. Now, the question then is to recognize the diversity of views out there in terms of understanding Islam and also interpreting Islam within a certain context. But we also have to recognize that certain interpretations dominate more than others and become dominant in a particular society. So the question that has to be asked is, what are the conditions that make them dominant? What makes people choose the interpretation that you critique, that there is no compulsion in religion, bracketed, to enter Islam, and not the other interpretation that talks about freedom in general, or freedom of belief, right? So what are the conditions that make certain interpretations more acceptable or more dominant or more attractive to society? And that is something that needs to be investigated, because there could be many factors. There could be historical factors, right? There could be even psychological factors, the kind that you mentioned earlier, that we lack the self-confidence. But what led to that lack of self-confidence needs to be dig into a little bit more. The social context of a particular geographical or even a societal conditions. And I think what is important is to recognize that the dominance of certain ideas in society is due to patronage also. Why the Mu'tazilas were able to be quite dominant in the elite circles in Baghdad, for example, in the 9th, 10th century, is due to the patronage of the caliphs, like Ma'mun, for example. But then, which you also noted in your book, the tables turned when Mutawakkil came into power and decided to be a patron to the Ash'ari doctrine instead. And here I would quote from the historian Al-Mas'udi in the 10th century, when he said, when Al-Mutawakkil succeeded the caliphate, he ordered the abandonment of investigation and discussion and debate and everything which people had employed in the days of the previous caliphs. He ordered submission and the acceptance of tradition. Now, why did Mutawakkil do that? It serves his political interest. So we also have to question why, when certain interpretation or certain ideas on religion dominates, whose interest does it serve? So it's really a question of unpacking many of these things instead of just reiterating. For many reformist circles, we get frustrated because we keep on reiterating, yes, this is the values, this is what is there in our tradition, but somehow people are not listening and people are not accepting because there's a lot of sociological factors that needs to be uncovered, which includes like what Ahmad Kuru mentioned in his book, Islam Authoritarianism and Underdevelopment. It's a peculiar situation that has developed between the interests of the ulama class and the state interests that we can see consistently as a thread running through the development of modern Islam.
If you want, let me say one thing. I mean, let me address a few issues, then you can say a few more things if you want. I mean, you can take a second round. You said so many things, I'm afraid that I'll forget.
Just one final point, actually, before I pass it back to you, is that this whole idea that there is something about modern structures that has actually empowered certain authoritarian tendencies in Muslim societies. And I mean, in the past, we know someone can get, I mean, fatwas are not codified. We can get fatwas from different people, from different qadis even, right? But in a modern structure, the laws are codified, and that has got to do with the importation of certain structures that comes along with colonial power, that models the common law and Islamic law somehow got fossilized and also codified within these modern structures. And that created the kind of situation that is very difficult to extract authoritarianism from religious authoritarianism. And also once it's embedded in state structures, it becomes very difficult to extricate. And this has been in the works of people like Izzah Hussein, who wrote about the politics of Islamic law, or Tamir Mustafa in his recent book that talks about Malaysia, in fact, or even Mazda Muhammad's idea of the divine bureaucracy that has taken root in modern society, modern Muslim societies. So there's one idea that you have brilliantly put out in terms of the values, as well as the rethinking of some of the elements in our traditions, and to make it more central now. But there's also the sociological conditions and the political conditions that actually impedes the translation of these ideas into actual terms in modern society. So those are my early comments, and I would love to hear your response to that.
Thank you so much, Imran. Very, very pertinent emphases, points. You said many things, so I'll try to say a few things about them. One, let me begin with one thing. Why did, for example, groups like the Mu'tazila or the Falasifa emerge in early Islam? These were more rationalist schools of thought, which the Ahl al-Hadith always, disliked and ultimately pushed aside. Of course, there was some patronage. I mean, some during the Caliph of Ma'mun, Mu'tazila became the official view, and by the way, it was imposed, which was wrong, and then it turned upside down the other way. And before the Abbasids, of course, the Ahl al-Hadith view was actually the Jabriya view, was especially the official view under the Umayyads. So since the beginning of Islam, political power had intervened in our religion and defined what is right and what is wrong. And I think that was a problem. That was our problem. I'm not saying Ahl al-Hadith should be pushed aside. What I say in my book, in one chapter, I say, well, what we should have is plurality of ideas. I wish the Mu'tazila was making its own arguments and the Ahl al-Hadith was making theirs, and the philosophers were studying Aristotle, others were thinking that's not good, but they could all exist in Islamic society. But at some point, one view became silent. And Ibn Khaldun says in one passage that, now the heretics are silenced, nobody's doing theology anymore. Because these heretics or new ideas, challenges, make you more dynamic. Otherwise, you keep repeating the orthodoxy, which became a very dominant feature of, I think, late Islamic thought. Now, you said there has been power structures. Yes, one thing I actually emphasize in the book is that here's one thing, and that will connect to the issue of reform. When reformist Muslims come out and say things like, I'm probably a reformist too. I mean, I don't use the reform that much. I use tajdeed, which is our own term, which is renewal. But let's say we are saying new things, right? Especially about human rights, about women's rights, and about religious freedom and freedom of speech. There is an automatic, almost assumption that we are serving some Western powers, right? Oh, these guys are like, this is a Western agenda, and so on and so forth. Well, it is more complicated than that for two reasons. It is not that reformists are serving Western agendas. It's that reformists are exposed to the world more, and they understand that this is not going to work. I mean, you can't have a religious tradition who says we will kill people if they deny our religion and continue to be a respected religion in the modern day and age. You can happily say that in your conservative community in I don't know, Aceh province, but if you live in the Western world and you see that this is a problem, I mean, this is not going to happen, and you see that it's not even there, it's not even in the sources. So this was a historical interpretation. I mean, it's not an accident, but I mentioned slavery. The Muslims who advocated abolishing slavery were the ones who were exposed to the modern Western ideas. Because the idea came from the West, let's be honest. The idea that slavery should be abolished came to us from the British campaigns. It was the British in the world who started the abolition of slavery. America was very bad. That's why, they had a civil war for that. Still, there's a lot of residual problems of racism and so on and so forth. But uh, and the Muslims who thought that there must be something wrong with slavery were the ones exposed to the modern world. It is not that the reformists are like abandoning their faith or trying to be subservient. It's just they understand the world is complicated, and they understand that some of the arguments that make your in your local mosque that you should beat your wife but not with a very strong stick but with a very light stick doesn't doesn't convince people. There's something wrong with it. So, and I'll tell one more thing. The groups like Mu'tazila or the philosophers emerged precisely because of the same dynamic. They emerged in Iraq, where in Kufa, Baghdad, Basra, which were centers of trade, and where you had Christians, where you had Christian theologians, where you had people who knew Greek philosophy, you had Zoroastrians, you had different Mawali. I mean, it was not just Arab, but it was all these non-Arabic cultures. So they were trying to make a sense of Islam. They were trying to actually promote Islam to the non-Muslims. That's why they're known rationalists. It's not that they were following their hawa, that is kind of temptation, that they were not pious enough. No, they were pious. They just wanted to rationalize Islam for the non-Muslim. Whereas the Ahl al-Hadith in Medina, they were all Arabs. They already were all believing in Islam. They just said, we just obey and we don't want to rationalize things. That whole effort of rationalization is misguided, they thought. And it's a difference of context. You said, how do we popularize these ideas? I mean, Khalid Abu Fadl has great ideas, Fazlur Rahman. You mentioned a few other names. Yes, there are great scholars of Islam. Well, one thing is that these scholars are academics and they write academic books, and not everybody follows them, right? I mean, there are some, and that's one reason I'm actually trying to get into their works, get into their ideas, and make them more accessible to the common audience. So we need that sort of academic level of reformism into a more popular level where people can easily understand. And my books are a little bit towards that effort. That, I mean, everybody can understand this book. I mean, you have to know some basics, but you don't have to be a PhD scholar to read this big debate on. So we need popularization. Second, I think masses should understand. I mean, masses who think that all these reformists are serving some agendas of power from Western powers or whatever, they should also become suspicious that the conservatives are serving some agendas sometimes, right? They're serving the authoritarian sultan who doesn't want to be criticized. They're serving the prime minister who gives them, I mean, I don't want to get into politics, but I mean, Najib Razak was a prominent politician in Malaysia. He was telling about the evils of liberalism, how liberalism is evil. We have to fight against liberalism, and human rightsism and liberalism are terrible things. Well, he was not the most pious, austere Muslim, right? I mean, he is now, I think, facing very serious corruption charges. So I think conservatives should understand beneath the conservative pietist narrative, there can be interests there too. I mean, these dirty interests do not always happen in New York or London or wherever. They happen in Istanbul and Ankara and Riyadh and in Kuala Lumpur or wherever. I mean, right? So the connection between interest and knowledge is a universal problem. It's not just something connected to the West. And actually our history is full of that. And that's one reason I tried to show how the caliphs supported the traditionalists who preached obeying the sultan whatever he does, right? I mean, the sultans like that sort of teaching. One final point you made, I think, on modernization. Some of our problems come from modernization in a bad way, bad modernization, because we never got the liberal water. I mean, I'll speak of Turkey, for example. I don't know the history of Malaysia that well, but Turkey, my country, the Ottoman Empire, I mean, it began modernization in the 19th century. Codification of Islamic law came in the late 19th century. Before it was actually more pluralistic, so there was not one codified law of the land. But this didn't necessarily translate into a liberal, democratic, pluralistic state. It translated into a leviathan in a huge state that controls every resource, makes its own law, and also imposes it, and unification of powers, which was Ataturk's famous motto. So, modernization can be a good thing if it brings more freedom, respect, tolerance, and all those things. Modernization can be a fascist modernization too, where everything is united at the hands of an autocratic state. That's what Arabs had. I mean, in most Arab societies. I mean, Egypt is a modern republic. It's a modernized republic. So Sharia is not a part of the penal code, at least. So it's in the family code. But Egypt is a very tyrannical state. I mean, today and before Arab Spring too. So that's why the point is not being secular merely, being merely modern. The point is, are you tolerant? Are you free? Do you have room for society to act on its own? And I believe for that we need a renewal of ijtihad. But if we just replace Islamic law with secular but fascist law, I mean, there is no blessing to that. And I've seen that in Turkey, and we've seen that in Iran in the 20th century under the Shah. We've seen it in socialist Arab republics. I mean, Syria is a secular state under Bashar al-Assad. It's one of the worst, most evil tyrannies humanity has ever seen in terms of the destruction it has brought its own citizens and the tortures and everything. So that's why modernization in terms of building up a centralized, powerful bureaucracy that unifies all the power in its hands, that in itself has been a part of the problem of the Muslim world. And when the only alternative is a medieval archaic jurisprudence, it becomes a vicious cycle between these two forces.
Mm.
Does this answer your point? I don't know.
Yeah. I think it does respond to some of the concerns that I've mentioned earlier. I guess the problem that, or rather the elephant in the room, is really the how the doublespeak of some of the Western interests in terms of allowing freedom and democratic impulse to be there in their societies, but then it's a different matter when it comes to their dealings with Muslim societies. And that causes that frustration and that psychological blocking of many Muslims when they look at some of these scholars who are really at the cutting edge of developing reformist ideas, and they are based in Western universities.
You know why?
Yeah.
Because they couldn't survive.
Exactly.
I mean, if Fazlur Rahman was not given a death fatwa in Pakistan, he would continue teaching in Pakistan. But he had to come to the United States, teach at the University. It's our fault that these people are going to the West. And by the way, it's not just reformists. Islamists also escaped to the West. Rashid Ghanouchi, I mean, actually, he's a reformist Islamist in many ways. But Rashid Ghanouchi spent many decades in Europe because the Arab Spring in Tunisia. Why? Because Tunisia's secular autocracy was going after him. Ayatollah Khomeini went to West, under the Shah. So before the Iranian Revolution, he was in France. So today, people escape from, Uyghurs escape from China and go to the West. I mean, if you have a more free part of the world, people escape to that. And you cannot blame those people if you're threatening them at home and giving them no chance for survival, for flourishing, no platform.
Exactly. But the irony of it is also that some of the more radical and extremist elements got sheltered within the framework of freedom of expression in Western societies, and they're able to export them from the very democratic and open society and export them to other parts of the world, especially back to the Muslim communities, from the comfort and protection of freedom of speech in Western countries. And this is something that is quite a double bind for many people who saw the need for openness and democratic platforms, and that is being offered in Western societies. But at the same time, it also has a tendency to absorb the more radical extremist elements, shelter them, and also allowing it to be re-exported back to the Muslim societies.
I mean, there's an irony there. I think the West should preserve its high standards of free speech, but there's an irony there. I mean, I see sometimes hardcore Islamists in the UK, for example, saying how evil is liberalism and how liberalism should be destroyed. And they're having this conference in the capital of liberalism, right, UK, and they can have it. And that's why liberalism is good. And they will say, Islam will come and it will be much better. It will be perfect. And you ask which one? I mean, why don't you go to Saudi Arabia? No, that's not good. Why do you? No, that's not. Where is your true Islam? It's not here yet, right? It will always come. It's like this socialism that which always on paper looks wonderful. Whenever you implement it, it turns into a dictatorship. So I mean, I don't believe Islam is a political system. That's why I'm criticizing their point of view there. I think the reason why these ideas, I mean, anybody who escapes from the Muslim world goes to the West and has a voice there is related to the fact that we don't have freedom of speech. And if we had freedom of speech, those people would be contributing to their societies, would have a better engagement with the circles there. And also, it is wrong to think that the Western powers always have supported liberal Muslims. I mean, Wahhabism have found enormous support first from the British against the Ottoman Empire, because it was a revolt against the Ottoman Empire. Then, during the 80s, Afghan Mujahideen, hardcore Salafis were blessed by America and the CIA against the Soviets. Things change after 9/11. So, I mean, Western foreign policy changes. Western powers, like Russia, like others, might be supporting this or that element in the Muslim world for their own interests. We should criticize that. We should be cautious about that. But this is not a reason for us to shut down our own internal discussion about what is the right message of Islam. And I think by obsession with what some others are saying, we're not looking into what we ourselves are saying and should be saying.
Yeah, thank you. And that's why I think a lot of people appreciate you being very frank about this need for internal reform that we talked about earlier. Now, I will open this to people who have questions, and there's been a couple of questions emerging in the chat. But before that, I have two very brief questions. Mustafa, one is you earlier talked about this tradition of tajdeed or even Islah. And that is something that is embedded within the Muslim tradition itself. And Muslim tradition is actually very dynamic, and it's in a constant stage of reforming at every instances in relation to the changing context and conditions of society. But this is where the vision of reform has two contestations. One are those who say that we have to make Islam relevant or conform to the conditions of the current modern world. Versus those who say that the kind of thing that we need to do is not to make Islam conform to this world, but rather to make the world conform to Islam. So it's a more ideological response, and both actually believe in the need to engage in reform with the current context, but from two different angles with two different ends. So what do you have to say about that? That's my first question. And my second one is, again, going back to this whole dynamic of Muslims reaction to the West and also the encounters with the West, which has been occurring for centuries. But what makes someone like Rifa'at Tahtawi, for example, has a very embracing as well as positive view of Western civilization when he was in France, in Sorbonne. And in fact, he says that, in the West, I see Islam, but not Muslims.
Without Muslims, yes.
And then when he went back to Egypt, it's the opposite. I see Muslims, but not Islam. Compare that to the reaction that Said Qutb had when he went to America, which make him think differently about the West. It's decadent, it's immoral, and he came back and he engaged in a different activism. So what actually can you say about these two modes of thinking that make them have different responses? Yeah.
Sure. First of all, I think it's not that simple to say whether modern world should conform to Islam and whether Islam should conform to the modern world. I mean, I'm not going to say this or that, but because I think Islam has things to say to the modern world, I'm not saying that everything in the modern world should be univocally accepted by Muslims. But I also believe that Islam should speak to the age and its culture and its context. because I believe Islam initially spoke to its own pre-modern context. I mean, when you read the Quran, look at family issues, for example, family matters. Look at idda, I mean, how a man should divorce a wife. As I showed in my book, the commandments of the Quran about these family issues in the Quran are very much related to the existing Arabic culture of the time. So the Quran is operating in that culture, and the intentions of the Quran are universal and eternal, but the injunctions there are, I think, time bound. One question, I mean, why does the Quran give corporal punishments? You know, that's a big topic, right? I mean, people generally, some people obsess about implementing those. A lot of people are fearful about that. Like, why does the Quran says cut the hands of a thief, amputate the hands of thieves? Should the modern world conform to Islam, or like that you should have corporal punishments everywhere on this matter? Well, my answer to you is that the Quran brought corporal punishments because the Arabs were giving corporal punishments to all crimes. Pre-modern Arabs were also giving hands, cutting of the thieves was what they did in Mecca and Medina at the time, and we know from Islamic historians themselves. So the Quran was legislating in a society where there was no prison at all. Corporal punishment was the only norm and legislated according to that. So I believe goals of Islam, values of Islam, maqasid al-Sharia are universal, but their implementation is already historical. And in a very different historical setting, we certainly have to rethink a lot of things. And one thing, it is accepted that Islam does tajdeed, right? I mean, we have a tradition of renewable, but the pace of change in the past 2 centuries in human history is unlike anything other. I mean, modernity, the change that comes up with modernity is fundamentally different from what we had before. I mean, you can say we have a tradition of tajdeed, so some of the jihad issues we can now work them out a little bit, which is fine. But we should not forget that the whole idea of Islam and war, qital and jihad, was developed at a time when war was the condition of humanity. There was no international law. There was no United Nations. There were no countries with borders that, you know, they make a deal that we're not going to occupy you. It was an age of empires that Muslims 1,000 years ago could not imagine that they could be outside of the land of Islam, Darul Islam, and be free to preach their religion, open mosques, and even propagate Islam, and even gain converts to Islam, as you can have in the Western society. So what I'm saying is that, yes, we have a tradition of tajdeed, but we not only block that to some extent, plus the world has changed so dramatically and radically that our pace of tajdeed remains very slow in the face of that. This doesn't mean I think everything in the modern world should be embraced and we would have no value. But the question is, with our values, what do we say to the modern world? And for that, you have to be able to distinguish value from the context in which it was implemented or expressed. So what was the other question? I mean,
Yeah. Okay. Before that, just a very quick
Sure.
comment in relation to that. I guess it's also a difference in the vision of history, where on one hand, there are those who look at history as a progressive movement, but there are also those who look at history as a devolution moving towards the end times. And therefore, the best period in history was during the prophetic period, where there was a direct connection and communication with God. And if it's good enough to cut off the hands of a thief during the prophet's time, then that is something that cannot be abolished. But that is where some reformists try to moderate that stance by saying that we put a moratorium, or we don't do it now because the conditions are not there, but without expunging it totally and say, look, we need to revisit the whole text and argue it in a different way, that there's no way in future, not now, not future, that we ought to re-implement this, just like slavery itself. We are not saying it's to be, it's a period of darura, you know, we don't practice it, but with this view that maybe in future, when the conditions are right, we do it again. So it's a two contesting vision.
I know that, and I do believe that there is some evolution in human history in terms of values as well. I mean, democracy was not a popular idea until a few centuries ago. There were tyrannical rules, and when you look at reason, you can see that, I mean, democracy has evolved in human history, and I think that's been generally better than, you know, absolute monarchies or absolute tyrannies. So, I mean, that's a huge topic, but I do believe humanity, by God-given reason and conscience tests certain ideas, goes through some evolution, and I'm not saying speaking of biological evolution here, but mental development, inkishaf, and I think that things may get better over time. Now, to those who would say everything was already perfect at that time and binding, I mean, for example, corporal punishments. The Quran gives corporal punishment, so that must be the universally most important, valuable, I mean, unchanging norm. I'll ask why pre-Islamic Arabs were also giving corporal punishments. Was Jahiliyyah very wise about this? Or, I mean, those Muslims who think that the way Prophet Muhammad lived and dressed, think that this is the Sunnah. I mean, they can practice that. I have nothing against it. But I'll ask, was Abu Jahil a very great Sunnah follower then? I mean, he was dressing up the same way, living in the same way, or live, you know. The Quran came to a existing culture, in my view, and improved that culture. It kept certain things which couldn't be changed. It condemned certain things which was violent, which was morally very repugnant. So I think I look at it from that point of view, because otherwise you would have a hard time in explaining why the idea of a concubine is there in Islamic law. I think the Quran comes to a society where there were concubines, and the Quran tells Muslims not to force them into prostitution, which the Jahiliyyah Arabs were doing. So it is actually bringing a dramatic improvement, moral improvement. But the institution was still there. Does it mean that we should preserve the institution, or we should understand that the Quran has an intention here? It's true, some people see that was the moral ideal. I'll just tell them one thing. I mean, if we so idealize the formative era of Islam, I mean, the time of Prophet Muhammad, of course, is different. It's there's revelation there. But just look after. I mean, look after the Asr Sa'adat, which generally people include the four Sunni first caliphs. I respect all those first Muslims, the Sahaba, but let's not forget that they had bloody civil wars. I mean, the Battle of Camel, the Battle of Siffin, was that the ideal political model? If they had a system of democracy, would things be better? If they had idea that there are elections in every 4 years and, you know, local elections, maybe things would be more peaceful. Well, no, they didn't. They couldn't imagine that. They were living in a culture where the tribes were still important, and you take the caliphate by the sword, and it was there. I mean, so the fact that early Sahaba went to civil war shows that the political culture of that time isn't divinely mandated, and it isn't universally binding. There were pious Muslims who lived in a time which was different than ours, and if we have some better institutions today, we should be happy with them.
Yeah, I guess even those who advocate for this, or the idea of the perfect past, also they've been very selective in what they choose from the past also. Yeah, of course. Do you want to answer the second question about Kutub
which was,
and Tahtawi?
Sorry?
Said Kutub and Tahtawi, two different
Oh, yeah. I mean, that quote, I mean, I went to Europe, saw Islam without Muslims, and I came back, saw Muslims without Islam. I mean, whether Muhammad Abdul said that or Tata, that's a famous quote whose origin is hard to pin down, but it certainly reflects the time. Now, that generation, the first generation of Muslims who were exposed to Europe, saw Europe mostly before colonialism. I mean, there was a French invasion of Egypt for a while, but it passed. They saw Europe with its successes, with its technology, with its rule of law, with emerging democracy, and they admired a lot of things about it. And I think they were right in many ways. Now, in the 20th century, after World War I, when the whole Islamic world was almost colonized, I mean, Middle East was colonized by the French or the British or Europeans, there was understandably a reaction to the West. So the 20th century Islamism is much more tough than the 19th century so-called Islamism, because it was a colonial context. So the West was the enemy that was really occupying your lands and humiliating your people, the memory of Algeria, French occupation, and so on and so forth. Plus, Sayyid Qutb, some people think that Sayyid Qutb was humiliated in America because of his skin color. You know, America has a big racism problem still today. It was much more so in the 50s. So I mean, that's one theory. People don't know why he was reacting so much against that. But today, it's not an accident to see many pious Muslims who live in America and appreciate a lot of things in the society in terms of rule of law, in terms of the freedom they have. And I think the Sayyid Qutb experience was an extreme one. And I think the Tahtawi intuition is fundamentally right that, I mean, you can also admire a lot of things in Japan or South Korea today. It doesn't have to be the West. But any society where justice is served, people are respected, there's security, the government doesn't come and torture you for your ideas, these kind of things. These are good, and we may appreciate it in any society, whether East or West, and we can compare our existing social condition with those societies.
Thank you. Let's get to some of the questions here. There's one that is quite interesting. Will it be too far-fetched to state that the overly predominance of the Hadith corpus in the practice and beliefs of Muslims has stymied the Ummah from progressive thought? So is the idea of the Hadith being a problem in terms of interpreting Islam? And maybe as an extension of that, what do you think of the Quranist movement that somehow says that we just rely on the Quran because there's a lot of issues with the Hadith?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Very good question. I will say a qualified yes to the first question, in the sense that, I mean, when you look at the whole Ahl Hadith movement, which emerged in Medina against the Ahl Ray, the people of reason, rationalist jurists. By the way, the rationalists were Hanafi. I mean, it's not outside the Sunni fold again. When you look at the Ahl Hadith movement, they were really worried that jurists in Iraq, the rationalist jurists, were using too much of their reason to make judgments on fiqh matters. Istihsan, I mean, I prefer this instead of this one. So they were using the human capacity to discern right and wrong. Now, if that tradition define our jurisprudence would be more dynamic and more open to change. Because if you understand that what Abu Hanifa judged in the 8th century Iraq was according to the way he judged the social conditions of the time, and you have different social conditions today, that whole dynamic interpretation of fiqh, I think, was more promising. Ahl Hadith emerged precisely because they were worried about this and they wanted to find a prophetic tradition on everything. Now, one should understand that it's not that there were all these hadith collections and they came defending them. No, they wanted to write the hadith collections because they were worried about the rationalists. And at the time, more than a century has passed since Prophet Muhammad. There were some written texts, but most hadiths were oral traditions. So mapping out these hadith through Sanad, through the people who narrated from one person to another, has become the main challenge and the main mission of the Ahl Hadith movement. So they wrote these huge collections. I think an Islam without the hadiths, as the Quranists are saying, is not a good idea. I don't think it's reasonable, because I think we need the hadiths because they give us an incredible historical context. I mean, the Quran is speaking of some things in passing. We don't know what happened there. I mean, hadith and sirah, the biographies of the Prophet, I think we need them. So I think the Quranists are making a mistake that you read the Quran in every age without knowing any history, and you just understand it right away. So this makes them sometimes understand the Quran without its own context, and make some jumps from the Quran into some unwarranted jumps into some modern concepts. However, hadiths should not be binding over the Quran. Quite the contrary, Quran should be binding over the hadith. So I'm not a Quran only Muslim. I'm a Quran first Muslim, as somebody put it a while ago. So the Quran is a primary source. Nothing can override the Quran. Hadiths are important to understand, but when we look into hadiths, we should be cautious. For example, when I read a hadith which says, obey the ruler even if he flogs your back and takes your wealth, I suspect, did Prophet Muhammad really say this? Or a ruler who was an autocrat, a tyrant? And is it possible they put this into circulation? I think we should give up the idea that every Sahih hadith is really authentic. Every hadith is defined as Sahih. I think the approach of the early Hanafis and the Mu'tazila about the content, not just the isnad, not just the chain of narrations, but the content of the hadiths, should be important. And we should take the primacy of the Quran over the Hadith and Sirah. And by the way, new versions of Sirah are coming up. The new texts are being discovered that are telling about the life of the Prophet Muhammad. So we need all that. We cannot have an Islam devoid of anything other than the Quran. But the Hadiths have fixated us on so many issues which should have been open to interpretation and ijtihad.
Of course, I will add to that also, is that it's just not just the hadith that actually helps to explain some of the things in the Quran, but also we need the other disciplines like knowledge of society, knowledge of history,
Yeah.
all other disciplines in order for us to understand better the hadith as well as the Quran. And that has been the call of a thinker in this part of the world, Said Hussein Alatas, who said that we need to understand the sociological context first before we can even understand the hadith or even some aspects of the Quran.
That's true.
Yeah. So moving on to the next question. Here I have one question from Hafiz, but this has been covered earlier about what were the conditions that facilitated self-confidence of the Muslims. So I think you have covered that, but here's another question here. To what extent has the decline of the scientific culture over the centuries contribute to the intellectual or spiritual lethargy of Islam, of Muslim societies?
Decline of scientific culture?
Yes. Can you talk a little bit about the decline of the scientific culture that has contributed to the lethargy today?
Yeah, I mean, that's a chapter in my book. I recommend reading that, How We Lost the Sciences. And I mean, this is a huge topic, by the way. I mean, what happened to the scientific development, scientific creativity of the early Islamic civilization? Why it faded, and today Islamic world is not advanced at all, scientifically speaking. There are, of course, a few bright spots with thanks to modernization in the past 100 years. I mean, to give a very rough point, I mean, 1,000 years ago, if there were Nobel Prizes, all of them would go to Muslims, as one American scholar once said. Today, we have very few of those Muslim inventors and scientists with cutting edge. And if they are, they sometimes, by the way, come from the West. I mean, today, for example, I think the two greatest scientists of this past year was Dr. Özlem and Uğur Türeci, who are Turks, who found the Pfizer vaccine. But they were in Germany, so they were raised and they're living in Germany. So why? This is a huge topic. Some people will deny that there's a decline. They say, well, that this is just an Orientalist narrative. And well, I'm not that optimistic about the state of affairs. I think there was a stagnation, not necessarily a decline, but a stagnation of thought, including scientific approach. And I think it has something to do with the delegitimization and marginalization of the philosopher. Because the philosophers, people like Ibn Sina, Farabi, Ibn Rushd, were the ones that had this passion of discovering the universe with all its secrets through rational tools. And the fact that they were, because of some metaphysical doctrines, they were condemned as kafir, they were falling into heresy, delegitimized the idea that you can investigate truth separately from religion. So, I mean, what is philosophy? Philosophy is this, I mean, we think of philosophy today as only contemplating about complicated issues in your head, but also it implied science 1,000 years ago. Because, I mean, Ibn Sina was a philosopher, which means he was a medicine expert. He knew medicine and he wrote about it, and actually that influenced Europe for many centuries to come. So I think the delegitimization of the search for truth that is independent from religious texts in itself had a negative impact. And one of the experts on Islamic sciences, Dimitri Gutas, has a powerful article about this, which I quoted in my book. I recommend that. It's a very, groundbreaking article, I think, on his issue. Scholars are divided, but I'll tell you one thing. I mean, when you go to, I mean, there were, of course, scientists who were coming from the Ash'ari tradition as well. But I think as a general worldview, the worldview of the philosophers and even the Mu'tazila was more open to a more scientific investigation of the world because of the emphasis they made on reason, which includes empirical investigation of the world as well. You see this in Al-Jahiz, the first great Mu'tazila, one of the scholars, and who wrote the Kitab al-Hawayan, the Book of Animals. You see this in Ibn al-Haytham, the discoverer of optics, who was at the House of Wisdom. Some people blame the fall of Baghdad by Mongols, but then that tradition lived partly in Central Asia. I believe we lost the passion, the curiosity to discover. Everything is already known by our scholars who know the Quran and the Hadith and the fiqh. So the curiosity that there's something to discover interesting out there, we lost that. One example, I'll tell you one thing. We Muslims are generally unhappy with the Orientalists, right? Orientalists are these bad people who are coming from the West and studying our religion, right? That's the perception. Well, some Orientalists are, I think, good people. Some Orientalists are bad. There's a nuance there. I mean, some had very good intentions. But most Orientalists, actually, who studied Islam, add that intellectual curiosity to discover another religion. Now, do we have the other way around? Do we have great scholars of Islam who are incredible experts on Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism? A few, but nothing compared to that. So instead of being angry at other people for being Orientalists and studying our religion, let's ask, do we study our religion as much as they do? Some of us do, but do we study their tradition at all, or do we show no interest in it? Yeah. I think lack of intellectual curiosity is really an important dynamic here, which has something to do with the religious worldview, as I tried to do in my book. And I showed how Imam Rabbani in the 17th century said, what's the benefit of geometry? It's totally useless. It's one of the stupid sciences of the philosophers. Whereas, Ottomans would see that soon geometry is needed because you need to make better weapons. And they started importing European advisors to teach geometry to Ottomans, which we had lost at that point. So, Westernization and modernization didn't start out of nothing, and we should see that there was a stagnation in our thought. It's the decline of non-religious sciences, akli, rational sciences in our madrasas, in our thinking, in our public consciousness.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting book that I've read is the Islam and Science by Pervez Hoodboy. That really criticizes, even with current Muslim re-engagement with science, it has taken a very problematic path with the idea of Islamization of science, which is an extension of Islamization of knowledge. That somehow our engagement with some of these new disciplines or even modern disciplines is actually to just re-Islamize them. And therefore you have some bizarre conferences being held, and this was described by Professor Woodboy, like looking at the otherworldly dimension, like the time in the period of the jinn and things like that, instead of really contributing to the growth of humanity and civilization, as what the earlier Muslim scientists had done. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? Yeah.
Well, yes, the approach of Islamization of science, I think, is a wrong approach. Why can't we be comfortable without labeling everything Islamic, right? I mean, how do you Islamize chemistry? When you make an Islamic chemistry experiment, is it different from the chemistry experiment that an atheist will do in another part of the world? I think this shows our approach to define everything on the basis of our religious texts. Whereas I believe our religious texts, in particular the Quran, calls us for an open-ended investigation and engagement with the world. The Quran doesn't tell us to Islamize everything, but to go learn everything with a Muslim perspective. So I think it's this obsession. I mean, Muslims drinking Coca-Cola instead of Coca-Cola. There's a cultural thing to it. Like, we want to Islamize everything before it enters our universe, right? Whereas, well, if it's not haram, if it's not against Islam, everything is already open to us. We don't have to Islamize it. And I think that is an example of us closing ourselves in a cultural ghetto, that this is the Islamic way of life, this is the Islamic way of thinking, this is the Islamic way of chemistry, this is the Islamic way of biology. Instead, we should look into what humanity has developed with reason, which is a God-given capacity to humans, and the empirical sciences. And once we learn that, we should look back and say, how do we make a sense of this from our religious perspective? But our religious perspective should not limit and define that very investigative effort to find nature. And Ibn Rushd has interesting writings about that. I mean, I think my book touches upon those issues. He says, I mean, if everything is boiled down to God's will and there's no natural law, for example, we would lose the sciences. He's making those warnings. He was, but we didn't pay much attention, I think.
Thank you. Of course, the first Nobel Prize winner in science is Abdul Salam, and somehow the Muslim world doesn't recognize him simply because of
sectarianism.
Sectarianism, yeah. There's a very good Netflix documentary on that.
Yes, I've seen that. I highly recommend that. And it shows, I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, we want to Islamize science, and even our Islam is very narrow, right? We're not going to accept, oh, that guy is not Islamic either, so let's just, wipe him out too. So
yeah,
it's like, it's not good. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, here's an interesting question. I guess if I can restate that, it's this whole idea of freedom that somehow in the Muslim sense needs to be, there's no absolute freedom because there's consequences to that. And the idea of having an afterlife has an impact in curtailing absolute freedom, and therefore it also makes you a bit more responsible in relation to your life on earth. Whereas the person said that in liberal states like the US, sometimes take for granted the ability to believe what they want, express those beliefs openly, and face absolutely no retribution or consequence for doing that. So the question is, what is your opinion for those who believe nothing in the day after death, in the afterlife, while it is related on, then how then do they be made to conform to laws while stating that freedom? Because if you don't believe in the afterlife, you can do anything you like, and therefore you can, there'll be chaos and,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
well, there is no tension in believing in afterlife and believing in freedom on the face of the earth. Quite the contrary, I believe in freedom partly because I also believe in afterlife, right? I mean, I'm responsible to God. So this is my test on earth. So I should be able to do my test correctly. So it is my responsibility as an individual. I'm responsible to God. And to live that responsibility, I need freedom from the state and society. Here, I think we should define what freedom means. There is no absolute freedom. Of course, there's no absolute freedom anywhere on earth, and there shouldn't be. Like, you shouldn't be allowed to get drunk and drive your car 200 miles per hour on a highway because you'll probably kill somebody, and you would be a threat to other people. I mean, in every civilized society, your freedom ends at the point that you began to threaten the rights of other people. You cannot, make an experiment of an atomic bomb in your backyard because you can, kill your neighbor. So, I mean, there's a famous saying that your freedom to throw a fist ends when somebody's face begins there. So, to live in an orderly, peaceful society, there are regulations, but this doesn't mean that in your private space and without harming other people, you cannot believe in what you want or you cannot say what you want. And yes, there are limits to freedom, but it's very different in North Korea and Norway. So there's a huge spectrum of limiting freedom. I believe people should not be deprived of their freedom unless they clearly violate the rights of other people. So they should be able to believe in any religion they want, practice their religion in the way they want. They should be able to wear niqab in France, which the French illiberal secularists are banning, and they're not. I'm not happy with those. Some of the secularist illiberal approaches in Europe. But a woman should be able to not wear a hijab in Iran and Saudi Arabia and dress the way she wants. And societies naturally orderly arrange these things because people, when you act in a very awkward way, people look at you, they think you're a little awkward. So society already has natural pressures on individuals sometimes, but these things should not be based on law. So I believe that Muslims should be as pious as they want to be, but Muslims who do not want to be pious should have their lifestyle freely, and they should not be, chased by the religion police. If they're atheists, they should be able to speak out their mind and write atheist books, and it will be good for Muslims to counter those books with other books, which was how the greatness of the Islamic civilization was made possible in the first place. So belief in afterlife has nothing against this, because belief in after. Now, freedom doesn't mean that as a Muslim I will not obey any rule of my religion. No, I will obey the rules of my. I don't eat pork, so I refuse the freedom to eat. There is the freedom to eat pork, right? In America, I can go get it. I will never do that. But it is me who is limiting my, you know, it is me who is imposing that rule onto myself. I'm saying it is against my religion, so I'm not doing it. So there is no tension here between your religious convictions and the afterlife. Orthodox Jews will live very piously in Western society. They will not do some things other Westerners may be doing. It's their choice, it's their freedom. That's wonderful. There's no problem with that. It becomes a problem only when somebody comes and punishes me for, say, eating pork, which I would not do anyway. But so freedom is not absolute, endless, answering of desire. And people think that when we preach freedom, we want everybody to throw cocaine parties and be not pious at all. No, it is your right to be pious, your freedom as well. But the other person might be pious in a way that is different from you, and maybe not pious at all, and that's his freedom. I lost your voice.
Sorry, yeah. Within the framework of human rights, and this is where the tension is, within the framework of human rights, freedom of religion includes freedom to change a religion, as well as freedom not to believe in a religion. And that kind of framework is not thinking from the religious lens, but thinking from the lens of citizenship. And we are living in this context of nation state, where there are multiple communities. The modern world is necessarily plural, that Muslims are not the only communities and should not be supreme. But that's the whole tension, because then the elephant in the room is this relationship between religion and state. So what do you have to say about this whole idea of separation of state and religion, or what we know as secularism? And that has been another point of tension that a lot of Muslims are struggling with this whole idea of separation of state and religion and the acceptance of the secular framework.
I support separation of state and religion with full religious freedom to religious communities and religious individuals. Because when I say that, people think of France. Well, I have some problems with the idea of laïcité there, which, for example, comes with some limitations on religious symbols, say headscarves in schools and things like that. I believe in I believe in the idea of limitation of religion and state, because if we don't do that, religion becomes a tool of the state very easily. I mean, people think that when you bring these things together, that'll be wonderful. It's be good for religion. No, whenever you make a religious state, when you build a religious state, the state inevitably chooses one interpretation of religion, that is Islam in this case, and imposes it on the rest. Like in Malaysia, the official religious view is Islam, right? Which Islam? Well, it's not Shia Islam for sure. As the Shia Muslims in Malaysia, they're not very happy with their state of freedom. Go in, check in Iran. Iran is an Islamic republic. Which Islam is it? It's Shia Islam. And ask the Sunnis of Iran, they will complain to you about a lot of discrimination. Ask the Baha'is, they're totally persecuted, which is a religious community that they do not recognize even. So I believe in a separation of religion and the state, and the states to just to protect the rights of citizens, regardless of who they are, regardless if they're Muslims and Shia or, Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Ahmadis, whatever. And people following their religious traditions voluntarily. Pakistan was based on that vision, by the way. I mean, in 1947, Muhammad Ali Jinnah has this beautiful speech, and he said, "You are free to go to your mosques, your temples. That's not the business of the state. You're free. This is a country of religious freedom." Unfortunately, Pakistan retreated from that a lot with the Islamization of laws and so on and so forth. The thing is, if we believe in our religion, why do we need the state? I mean, we need the state to protect us from theft. We need the state to, I don't know, build highways, maybe to collect trash, some services. But religion is our faith. So why do you officialize the faith? So that's my, and the thing is, religion in the pre-modern world was inevitably linked with the state. I mean, that was the case in Christianity, that was the case in traditional Islam too. But I think at some point Christians realize how terrible this is when in terms of its consequences. I mean, the idea of separation of church and state, religion and state, emerged in Europe with thinkers like John Locke after seeing all the persecution of the heretics in the name of religion. So they proposed this idea of separation to ensure everybody's tolerated. And I think we are having a similar crisis right now where, official doctrines, official religious doctrines, and states upholding a certain view of religion are inevitably persecuting others, discriminating against others at least. And I think it's the same lesson we have to get.
Yeah. Interestingly, of course, some Muslims will call for freedom of religion when they are in a minority situation and facing Islamophobia in the West, but not when they come back to the majority comfort in their own.
Yep. I mean, I wrote about this. I wrote an article in the New York Times a few months ago with my Indian colleague, Swami Iyer. It was a co-author piece. Why Indian Muslims reach for liberalism. Today, Indian Muslims are cheering up for the secular constitution of India and promoting liberal values, and because they see that Indian majoritarian Hindu movement, Hindutva movement, Hindu nationalists are very threatening to Muslims and their rights. So they see the blessings of liberalism when they're a minority. If you just pass the border to Pakistan, there the people who are aspiring for liberal values are not the Sunnis, which are the ones in India, but they are the Ahmadis, they're the Christians, they are the Shia. So, but I think it's unfair to ask for freedom when you're a minority and crush freedom when you're a majority. I mean, there's no virtue in that, and I think we should get the lesson that we need freedom everywhere.
Thank you. We only have a few minutes left, and there's still some questions. I'll pick one from Sheikh Farouk, who asks, you mentioned the importance about the disconnect between theoretical ideals and socio-political realities. What do you think is the cause of this disconnect, and how do you bridge this so-called gap? Quite a big question.
I didn't understand the first part. The disconnect between what?
Sorry? The theoretical ideals and the socio-political realities. So what caused this disconnect, and how do you bridge this gap?
Well, one can write another book on this question, right? It's a very good question, but also a very big one. Well, I think from what is asked in that question might relate to my work in the sense that we stopped looking at the consequences of implementing our ideas and just implement them no matter what, right? I mean, I'll give you one example. Are you familiar with the notion of triple talaq? I don't know if it's an issue in Malaysia, but it's certainly a big issue in India for many, many decades. There is this idea that a Muslim husband can divorce the wife instantly and irrevocably when he says, I divorce you 3 times in one instance. Even when you text your wife, I divorce you 3 times, SMS, 3 SMSs, she's gone forever. And she has to marry back to you. Now, this is what some jurists inferred from the Quranic verse on divorce. Others say that it will be in 3 different divorces, but still in the 3rd divorce, you're not going to get back your husband. So the husband should marry somebody else. It's called a tahlil marriage, to make it halal, to hulle, or in Turkish, to marry back the person. Now, this has been implemented because it's written in the Quran without, the social consequences, because jurists. But when you look into the Quran, you see that this verdict, very interesting verdict, had a very interesting context. In pre-Islamic Arabia, there was the idea that when you divorce your wife, the couple should wait iddah, like a period of 3 months, to see if she's pregnant or not. This was a good idea. No wonder the Quran continued that, because, I mean, when you divorce, maybe if she's pregnant, maybe you will get back. So to see that, it was a good idea. But some men began abusing this. They were saying to my wife, I divorce you. Then 2 months later, they were saying, I take you back. Then they were saying, I divorce you again. The man was doing this a dozen times to keep the woman for years hanging without even divorce or getting back. And a woman came to Aisha, the wife of Prophet Muhammad, and complained about this problem. and we know this from the literature. I mean, the Sirah literature, and I have that in my book. And based on this, because the men were keeping women hanging, the Quran ordered that you can divorce women for 2 times, but after the third time, you cannot take her back. So with this commandment, the Quran was correcting a big social ill in in its context, because there were these men who were keeping women hanging, neither divorcing them or letting them go. The Quran says you have to let them go at the end, otherwise you cannot take them back. So the commandment had a very important social context and social consequence, which was uplifting women, which was giving women more rights and protecting them from misogyny, from patriarchy, from these male thugs, basically, who happened to be their husbands. But when you lose that context, when you don't understand what is the intention of the Quran, and when you plus make 3 divorces into one setting with a particular interpretation that some jurists did, you end up implementing the verdict of the Quran but going against its own intentions. So I think the social consequences of jurisprudence, the maslaha, should be the key. Some jurists, emphasize that very heavily, like Ibn al-Tufi. I mean, in the classical era, the importance of maslaha, that is the the social good that you want to achieve from the Islamic rules. But there are others who will say we implement this because it's a matter of worship and we do it without the social consequences. I think in Islam there are rules of worship, like we fast, we pray, we do Hajj. These are not about social benefit. I mean, we do it to worship God, and there's a spiritual benefit to it. But all the mu'amalat, all the social rules, are about bringing good, protecting the benefits of humans, and those benefits can change from time to time and place to place. That's why the mu'amalat should be very dynamic.
Thank you. I think one last question, since we are on this topic also. Earlier you raised about triple talaq. So let's move to this question about women's issues, which has been a major focus of reformists in modern time, about the idea of gender equality, for example. So a question is asking, hypothetically, what if after philosophical and social scrutiny, you come to the conclusion that we still need to have certain inequality between men and women pertaining to the division of tasks? Will you be open to accept that, or it has to conform to what you had assumed to be the standard, and therefore you will reject, even after coming to a robust philosophical and social scrutiny, comes to the conclusion that there's inequality that is natural? Will you be open to that?
Great question, tricky question. And I will say, well, I mean, I will consider any findings from social sciences on any issue, but I don't think that I will ever come to a finding from the social sciences saying that actually slavery is good. Some people deserve to be slaves. I don't think that's going to ever happen, and I will believe in that interpretation. And regarding gender equality, I'll say one thing: there are biological differences between men and women. That's very clear, and there's a movement which even denies that, which I find bizarre, and I'm not subscribing to that. I mean, women give birth and they need some time to recover after that and take care of their babies. So they need, for example, some time to take time off, paid leave, and so on and so forth. Those, I think, regulations can be made in any civilized society. It's not the same thing for men. But other than that, I think it's well established that women and men don't have different intellectual capacities. I mean, a lot of scholars in the medieval age thought that men are wiser and smarter than women, and women are lesser in their religion and their intellect, as one, disputable hadith reads. I don't think that's the case. I think we have enough evidence to know that women are as successful as men in all the intellectual fields of humanity and sciences, and they can make the best judgments as men do. So there is no lesser capacity of women besides some physical issues. So that's what I believe in, and that's why I believe that women and men should be equal with regards to the law. They should have the same rights in terms of divorce, in terms of inheritance, in terms of other, like being witnesses in a court. And I think the limitations on women on these issues was a reflection of the social condition in which Islam was born, rather than the goals of Islam. Ibn Rushd has important writings about that, which I related in my book, which I showed he was such a progressive or feminist, thinker back then in the 12th century. And I mean, the word feminist is very loaded. People generally don't like that term in our conservative Muslim societies, and it can mean different things. If it means campaigning for equal rights for women and believing that women should have equal rights, yes, I'm a feminist in that sense. I think all human beings should be equal under the law, regardless of race, religion, gender, or other sect. Even if they're noble scientists, they should probably be admired by their people, regardless of what sect they come from. I mean, referring to some other topic that you mentioned a few minutes ago.
Thank you, Mustafa. That was really a very good discussion, and we've covered quite a lot of grounds. And for all our viewers, thank you for staying and watching throughout the whole discussion. I'll just end by quoting from the last lines from his book. I think it is time for us to begin thinking anew, to reopen our minds, to embrace more reason, freedom, and tolerance. And I hope you will also engage with the ideas in his book. Thank you so much to Virtue IIUM for organizing this, and to everyone who's watching. I will pass this back to Alif for closing. Thank you, Mustafa. It's great.
Thank you, Imran. You wonderfully opened it and managed it, and thanks for also sharing the questions. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Let me know if you are coming to Singapore, or I'll see if we can invite you to Singapore.
I'll think twice before coming to Malaysia, but let's think about Singapore. Yes, thank you.
Inshallah. Thank you. Salam.
All right, so we have reached at the end of our discussion, and I would like to thank our speakers for the webinar of an analysis of reopening Muslim minds, Mr. Mustafa Akyol and also Mr. Mohamed Imran, for a very fruitful and beautiful discussion tonight. And thank you to all participants on Zoom and Facebook. And so before we end our program, I think we'd like to have a photography session. We're just going to have a screenshot.
Okay.
All right, wait. 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Okay.
Wait, can someone please? Can
I'll
someone
screenshot it. Okay, Hazan.
Right, everyone smile. 1, 2, 3. Right, one more time. 1, 2, 3. Right, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank
All
you.
right, on behalf of the organizing team, Virtue IIUM, I would like to apologize for any shortcomings while handling this discussion. And don't forget to follow Virtue IIUM social media platforms for more updates. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night, I guess.
Good night, good morning. Yes.
Good
Well,
one.
thank you, Nabilah, thank you, Mohamed, Imran, Elif, and others who organized this event. My best wishes, salams to everybody who's in Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, wherever you are from different parts of the world. I mean, these are the discussions we should have in the Ummah, and I'm not claiming to have all the right answers, but I'm trying to find inspirations and source of insight, wisdom in our own religious tradition that can make us move forward. Because I think every generation has its own challenge in our day and age. As Muslims, our challenge is to make a sense of our faith and discover the values of our faith and re-articulate them in the modern world, which is very different from the world that our ancestors, our forefathers lived in. So thank you, and Assalamu alaikum, and peace be upon you.
Thank you so much.
Mustafa.